Hi Year 11s, this is the last video for the classification PowerPoint, which is the first week of ecosystems. For this PowerPoint we're going to be looking at adaptations. For a little bit of a change for this time, there is an additional video inside this video which we will watch. But mostly we're going to be focusing on the different types of adaptations that species have done throughout the years to help make them their own species in terms of classification. So let's begin. So first off, I suppose we should probably talk about what an adaptation is. Often we'll say that an organism has adapted well to its environment. That doesn't mean that that organism has gained an adaptation. It just means it's been born with an adaptation that suits the environment, or it's either born with an adaptation that's not suited its environment. As more populations go forth, obviously the population will gain in the adaptations because the well-adapted animals' population will increase, and the animals that are not adapted to the environment, unfortunately, will pass away and not pass on their genetics. When we say evolution involves a change in the gene pool, we're saying that a population has gained an adaptation because individuals have been born with chances to survive, or higher chances to survive than others. So it's important to note that a living being cannot gain an adaptation in its life. You're either born with an adaptation or you're not. So for example, as humans, we could not all of a sudden become adapted to seeing at night time. We'd have to be born with that adaptation. You can't just in the middle of your lifetime, I can see in the middle of the night now. That's not how it works. Peppered moths are a perfect example of adaptations. So let's have a little bit of a look at the peppered moth.
The peppered moth is an icon for evolutionary biology. These moths, their survival is very dependent on their ability to hide from birds that are very fond of eating them. In the mid-1800s, all the peppered moths were of one type, kind of light and speckled in color. And then around 1850, the first black moth was recorded. And following that time, it replaced this typical form.
This is waste, representing a mighty bill we all must pay, whether we live in smoky cities.
A mutation happened in the 1800s that produced this change in the population. Now we know the specific sequence in the entire genome that causes the black type of the peppered moth to actually be produced. Our best estimate is that the mutation event happened in 1819, which fits in pretty nicely with the first record being in 1848 from the Greater Manchester region, in fact. You might think that a species is a species and is unchanging, but this example shows very graphically how that's not the case, that a species can change over time, and in this case, it can change very rapidly over time. That's happened because the environment has been changing. Is a sort of really obvious example of evolutionary change that is pretty incontrovertible.
So I'm just going to grab a few. So just quickly in the video, this is what a typical peppered moth looks like. So in the early days when we had peppered moths, you can see that it camouflages into the bark perfectly. So if I was a bird that was hunting this moth, I wouldn't be able to see it. Now, at the time, there was two species of moths. There was that peppered moth, and there was also the black moth. When they were first around, this moth is obviously going to stick out on the bark much more than the others. So if I was a bird flying around, which moth would I be able to see and eat? These ones. So majority of the population that survived to pass on the genetic information was the white peppered moth. Then we had the Industrial Revolution. So all of a sudden we had, I've lost that part of it. We had all this pollution and smog being passed around the world. Okay, all of that pollution and smog. And that, don't know why that's still moving. That basically, that covered all the trees. So all of a sudden, the black moths, they camouflaged better, and the birds couldn't see them. And the white ones stuck out, and all the smog that was on the trees, and the white ones were eaten. So the population changed to be more of the black peppered moths and the white peppered moths. That's an adaptation. Both species of moths survived. They didn't change colour to avoid detection. Both existed at the same time, but the environmental conditions changed, which made ones that were once poorly adapted to the environment become better adapted to the environment. So the population changed from being white-peppered moths to black-peppered moths. There are three types of adaptations. We have structural adaptations, physiological adaptations, and behavioural adaptations. Structural adaptations, basically, are the physical makeup of the animal. So, for example, the ears of a bilby are quite large, allow them to hear at night time and around to help them sense prey, etc. A physiological adaptation is a feature that's not physical, or it's not visible. Generally, it's to do with metabolic processes. So, for example, animals in the desert will excrete concentrated urine rather than urine very low in water, very high in water. So they're keeping all of the water in their body rather than excreting it in urine. Then there's behavioural adaptations. So these are basically adaptations that help an animal breed or survive in its environment. So, for example, the mating rituals of birds. They have mating rituals which are specific to attracting their other species, or the same species of bird. So, for example, a pigeon out there doing its little dance, fluffing up its tail feathers, etc., will only attract another pigeon. A magpie is not going to be interested in that. Why do adaptations occur? So, like I've said a number of times in this video, a careless observer will say that pollution caused the change in peppered moths. That observer is wrong. They haven't paid attention. Nothing caused the change in the moths. Black moths and white moths existed. White moths had a large population. Black moths did not. They were very small. The environment changed, and the black moths became more successful. They had more offspring. They became larger in numbers. The abiotic factor that influenced that adaptation was the pollution. The biotic factor was predation. So what caused that adaptation to occur? Not the moth, it was the pollution and predation. Those two occurrences, or the environment in general, created that adaptation. So, how does adaptations work within an ecosystem? And this is when we're going to lead into ecosystems. If environmental conditions were constant and they never changed, natural selection would always result in stable populations of individuals that are perfectly adapted to their environment. Individuals with desired traits would live, those without would die, and the population would shift to being only individuals with the desired traits. Selection pressures, which is what pushes an animal to change and a population to change, would remain the same. The species would no longer evolve, they'd reach a point and just stay. In the real world, environments change. Abiotic factors and biotic factors, living and non-living factors, are constantly changing, and they're helping to drive natural selection forward and pushing organisms to adapt to their environments repeatedly. Reproductive barriers. This is kind of a little bit of a different slide to the rest of the presentation, but this is important. Species can't breed with other species. So, for example, a horse can't breed with a pig. They're two different species. There's barriers there to prevent it. There's two different types. There's prezygotic and postzygotic. This is to prevent abnormal species being produced. So prezygotic barriers are ones that will prevent mating or fertilization of two species completely. A postzygotic barrier is, yes, those two animals have managed to mate and they have fertilized an offspring, and now that offspring cannot produce any more offspring. It's done. That's the end of the line. So there are four main prezygotic barriers. The first is temporal isolation. The word temporal means time. So that basically means that when one animal or one species is ready to reproduce, a different species is not. Different species have different times for mating or flowering or reproducing. Behavioural isolation. So back onto those mating rituals of birds. A pigeon's sexual attraction is not going to interest a magpie. They're not going to breed because they're just not interested in their different mating rituals. A mechanical isolation. Truthfully, the reproductive organs are just too different and they physically can't mate. And lastly, gamete isolation. That's just when two species do manage to mate, the sperm and the egg just won't ever fertilize because they're not compatible. Postzygotic barriers is for when two species can actually mate together and they can create an offspring that will be born. Or their egg and their sperm will fertilize each other. Good examples of this is a liger, which is a lion and a tiger, and a mule, which is a horse and a donkey. The two ways that prevent these species from continuing on is hybrid inviability. So first off, the zygote, the sperm and the egg meet, they've been fertilized. It fails to develop. The genes from the parents are too different, and it never is born. The pregnancy is aborted. They can't survive. But sometimes they do in the case of the ligers and the mules. And then we have hybrid sterility. So basically, a mule cannot have its own children. Meiosis cannot occur correctly, and the mule can never have children. So it stops there.